It's with a lot of pleasure that I introduce Craig. He's with the Denver Urban Gardens. He works on the community food forest projects and a lot of other stuff. So I'll just turn it over.
All right, thanks, Donna.
I didn't catch Dana. She's the expert in this.
Hey, everybody, it's really good to be here. My name is Creighton Hoffeditz. I'm the Director of Permaculture and Perennials for Denver Urban Gardens, which is by far the best job title I've ever had. And I'm really glad to be in a space where everybody understands all the words in my job, as opposed to like when I tell people and they give me a blank stare. So I'm going to be kind of talking about our food forest program at Denver Urban Gardens and give you kind of a little bit of a status update and talk about what our process has been over the last year and a half. I also just want to note that I became a dad 2 weeks ago. So if I say anything incoherent or strange, or if there's anything you don't like about this presentation, you can just chalk it up to extreme distraction and sleep deprivation. But it's really good to be here. I'm glad I was able to make it. I titled this Early Steps in an Urban Agroforestry Practice because we are pretty early on with this particular program, but also because I actually think about the program not as much an end in itself and the trees that we are planting ourselves, but what we're trying to do in terms of changing practices, changing understanding and awareness around agroforestry woven into the urban fabric. And that would go far beyond the actual sites that I'm going to talk about. So for some history, if you're not familiar with Denver Urban Gardens, it's a 40+ year organization. It's a nonprofit in the Denver metro area with almost 200 community gardens all around the metro area. And primarily they're focused on annual cultivation, individual plots that are rented out. And that's been most of the history of Doug. But then over the last couple of years, we have been broadening our programming, and specifically with my program, the new executive director was interested in perennials and the idea of food forests. She knew me from other work and other things and came to me and asked me to come on board to try and start this out. And one thing that I'll probably touch on a few times is that the fact that Doug already had an established organization has made my job a lot easier because we have established ties with municipalities and parks departments, other nonprofits, and we can say this organization has been here for 40 years. So when you ask me, how are you going to take care of these trees over the long term? I have some credibility in saying, well, the organization is not going to collapse tomorrow. That's, I think, just a great privilege that I've had that I think can be a difficult thing when you are proposing brand new project that has a generational timeline, as everything with trees does. So a little bit about how it started. Whoops, the formatting changed a little bit. It's fine. I'll just say what this is. I think some of the sizes changed as it was going between computers. So the Giving Grove is an organization in Kansas City that has been doing urban orchards since 2013. And in the last couple of years, they've started a program of national affiliates in different cities around the country. They're a really excellent organization to work with, and they're in sort of this expansion phase for urban orcharding and food producing trees in urban areas more broadly. And so they created a partnership with Doug in 2021, and they kind of put out the initial seed funding for 5 sites. I also call them food forests, orchards, forest gardens, perennial polycultures. I'll get to that in a minute. And then after, and I was brought on in, I think, January, February of last year. And then in May, the Etkin Family Foundation, which is based in Aspen, kind of got wind of our project and was connected and gave us a really generous donation to really expand up to 20 sites by the end of this year. And they were really driven by kind of an interest in food systems and high impact philanthropy. A lot of what I'm also going to talk about is the kind of excitement that's generated by these programs. And I think some ideas and tips that I might pass along for how to get people involved, how to get businesses involved, different organizations. So yeah, we're sort of in this big expansion phase right now. We have planted 15 so far, and we'll close out with 5 more this fall to get to our goal of 20. Our program is called the Food Forest Initiative, Doug. I kind of hate the term food forest. And I feel safer saying that in this group because some of you might know what I'm talking about. I use it all the time, and and yet I find it to be really non-specific and really open to interpretation. And some people in certain quarters, people who do work in, I would say, more like broad-scale agroforestry, orcharding, nursery work. They'll hear food forest and be like, oh, you're going to make a bramble patch that nobody's going to care about in 10 years. It's going to be neglected and it's not going to actually produce anything. Because that's the history of a lot of so-called food forests in different corners of the country, in different corners of the world. Even though we're talking about really a fundamental cultivation technique, the way that it's been approached a lot of times doesn't have, I think, a lot of care put towards how do we make these successful in the long term. And yet, food forest is a really, really captivating term for people. So for me, it's kind of a portal. It's kind of an entry point where even if I'm thinking about it as distributed perennial polycultures and forest gardens and these different kinds of things, if you say that with that level of jargon to businesses, to people who are new to it, to funders sometimes, depending where they're coming from, that's going to go right past. It's going to feel like they have to take several more steps before they understand what you're talking about. But food forest is this very evocative thing. So I do recommend dabbling in that term, if it makes sense, even on a broad scale, because it can captivate people. And then you can work within that. Because it's such a non-specific thing, you can make your food forest look all kinds of different ways. In a dryland situation like this, it's going to look different than it does in Atlanta or Maine, right? So I'm going to mention food forest, but just know that I'm always code switching when we're talking about interacting with lots of different groups of people. So when we're looking for a site in the urban area, there is a lot of space available, but a lot of it's marginal and a lot of it's not super large. I'm thinking about attracting eyeballs and interaction and not necessarily about getting the maximum number of trees. Mostly we're looking for places that have some kind of water access, because putting in a new tap is super expensive. At least 2,000 square feet, and carbon sequestration potential, which I'm kind of thinking of as I don't want to go into a place that already has a thriving ecosystem, that has deep soils, that has existing trees, and say, no, I want to put apple trees here. So we want to have something that's neglected in some way or underutilized. And what I really love is something that's a little bit larger, to 6,000 or larger in terms of square footage. People who are already interested in being volunteer stewards. So if you have community input already, as opposed to saying, help us with our food forest, we want to say, how can we help you achieve your goals? We want to find those people and activate those people. All along the Front Range here, not all of you are from the Front Range, but if you're doing fruit trees in the Front Range, you want to have cool microclimates. You want to have north and east aspect to delay the bloom time. So a north-facing slope that is covered in grass that's being watered and maintained and nobody's using, that's my ideal right there. Because we can get that water hogging grass out, we can make it a productive ecosystem, and we're not displacing anything that could be used for maybe more intensive food production. Something that's like flat and good for garden beds and could be used by people in a more intensive way. That might not be the best place for agroforestry in the urban area. We primarily don't use any fencing, and we don't really need great soil to start out with. So one of the pitches I make to people is, if this has been a neglected lot, if it is compacted, if it's been, a trash dump, our work of creating food producing landscapes is also going to heal the soil. You don't have to prepare that ahead of time. because of the way that these work. Right? So that's kind of some of the benefits that I'll list to people, or that I'll go around talking about. You know, initially we just had them right next to community gardens that Doug already had, because we had the land agreement, we had the water, we knew what to do, and then some of them now are freestanding. Sometimes people like YY will approach us and say, I hear you're doing this program, is this a good fit? And sometimes I'll go and I'll say, hey, I think you're doing this over here, would this fit with you? So we're kind of evolving how that process is going to work. For every site that we do, I'll come up with some sort of draft design and plan, say, you know, this is about how many trees we could fit, this is kind of the spacing, and then we'll have a community input meeting. That could be in a library or out in a schoolyard here. Several of these are based in schools, and actually in Denver, I think the largest non-governmental landowner of open space, of undeveloped open space, is Denver Public Schools. So much grass and so much wide open area. And that, I think, is probably a pattern that's repeated in lots of different cities. But we'll have a community input meeting where we talk about what we might grow, what people would want to see grown, and we try to have the species that we're picking reflect that community a little bit. Susan, at the beginning of your presentation, I think I saw a persimmon in the picture there. I don't know if it was a native persimmon or if it was a hybrid, but there's a cool persimmon called the Nikita's Gift, which is a hybrid of the Asian and American persimmon. So it'll survive in our winters, and it's a larger fruit. And so if we have a community that's primarily Asian American immigrants who are familiar with persimmons, I'm going to try and bring that tree in so that there's something that people can actually interact with and recognize and take care of more. Oh, that's really strange. I don't know how that. Yeah. Her name is Linden, because I can only do tree things.
She's got like the tree.
Yeah. She's, so moving. Yeah. So our site preparation, I think, you know, in Kansas City, where the Give and Grow started, they've given us some input, and they've put in a lot of these community orchards. They don't do a lot of interplanting in Kansas City. They're mostly putting in the individual trees, and they don't do a lot of site preparation. I'm going to say that's partly because they get double the rainfall that we get. So there's a lot more margin for error. They can pretty much just clear the sod back, plant a tree, and let it go. It may be more or less successful, but most of the time it's going to survive. What we have done is we've done a full volunteer workday for each of our sites before we plant, sometimes a month or two ahead of time, where we are running or extending irrigation lines. We just do hand watering, which I'll talk about in a second. We do use arborist contacts for wood chips and getting more organic material on the ground. And then we make these sunken basins. This is something that we're trying to do for each of our tree sites, where it's only a few inches down and they're about 8 feet in diameter. Just creating a little bit of topography to harvest rainwater, to reduce evaporation. This mimics long-standing indigenous techniques throughout drylands here and other parts of the world, where we're not going to be planting on mounds as much. We're not trying to shed water, we're trying to keep the water there. We keep a little bit of a raised area in the center to avoid crown rot for the trees we'll put there. But the other cool thing that this allows us to do is, and I think Wawa was actually touching on this in the food forest that's in Wheat Ridge, is once you have this established, the little tree starts here. We'll have a couple other woody perennial companions, nitrogen fixers, and berry bushes around. But there's a lot of room to plant other stuff. So for the first 5, 10, 15 years, you can be planting annuals in this basin and knowing that it's going to be watered. We're watering the trees. We're also watering the other things that are going to fill in. So in a way, I think of our sites sort of as creating little forest islands. As opposed to trying to have a full coverage, I'm responding to climate and saying, can we concentrate this in little areas here? And in some places, we're also able to open these basins if there's a slope, and to allow for overland water flow to kind of fill into more semicircular basins. And I just want to also touch on this hand watering piece. This is something that Denver Urban Gardens does at all the community gardens, and we're carrying on is that in a public situation, we want to have it as simple and as few parts to break as we can. So we really don't use drip irrigation anywhere, and there's too many fiddly parts that are going to get messed with, so they're going to get stomped on, and we won't necessarily see the leak. The other thing that that we see at Doug is that if you have to hand water and you don't have this on a timer, it means that whoever's taking care of the space has to come out. They're coming out once a week. They're putting 5 gallons of water, 5 to 10 gallons in each of these basins. And that means they're seeing it every week. They're getting in touch with other people. They're seeing each other, and they're getting more involved with the space. I think that can make the sites, like the requirement to water can actually be an advantage for us in drylands, where it requires attention and care in a way that some other climates don't. So I think that's something that I like to lean into when we talk about our maintenance and our people care there. Yeah, and as you can see, there's tons of volunteers here. We get lots of businesses and other nonprofits and groups that want to volunteer their time. So if we say we're doing this on this day, we now through the organization are able to plug them in. And I think on this day, the Broncos, they're not the players, but like some people from the Broncos organization were here, and a couple other groups, Be Local. And I will say that the trade-off, of course, is that they don't always do it very well. They don't always do the work super, super well. But then every time we do one of these plantings, we have 30 more people who've heard about what we're doing. They've heard about interplanting. They've heard about water harvesting. And in a simple way, they've heard about agroforestry, and that we can be getting food and medicine and beauty and habitat from trees. And so I think about the real power of these sites as being, yeah, we might plant 20 trees in one area, but what about the 300 houses immediately adjacent? What if all of those picked up and did a couple trees in each of their yards using these same principles, right? So we're thinking about trying to create a little bit of a domino effect. So this is also a really exciting event for me because I want to always keep advancing the way that we do things and learning best practices from people who are doing it in a business situation, who have to do it well to make their farms or ranches work. And so I'm curious about feedback, whether it's at the end of this session, we're in the question and answer thing, or over lunch. I'd love to hear thoughts about some of this stuff. We plant late April through late May and late August through late September. We don't plant later than that because we can get the really hard, quick frosts in October that can mess with the trees. So we have these pretty short planting windows. We're usually just adding a little bit of compost, mycorrhizal inoculant. We've played around with biochar and soil sulfur and bone meal, but that kind of gets complicated with volunteers. When you're planting with volunteers, you say, well, look, a little bit of this, and they say, how much? And it's like a dash, you know. So we're kind of figuring out how to standardize some of this, and I'm curious about techniques that people are using that are helping trees be more successful in the long term. And the other thing that we do, and why I had a picture of this at the Wheat Ridge site, this year we've started marking every single new planting with a stake, a rebar, and a pink cap on the top that says new planting. Because the other thing is that once you plant, you want to have people know that this is a thing. This is not something to be weed whacked or mowed over or pulled up. So the more that we can do this, we're having to over communicate and over sort of, I think, make it, you know, over articulate what we're doing, because there is so much coming and going of people who are not invested in the site. We want them to be public access, but we have to understand about like how to lead people in and help them care for it until they actually know how. These are some pictures of our plantings. This is a site that we're going to be at tomorrow as part of the tour. This is the Barnum Community Orchard. And this is a good shot here. Well, you can see this is a long-standing community garden that is mostly Russian and Ukrainian, Eastern European immigrants. And at the community input meeting, they talked about how important sour cherries, tart cherries are in Eastern European culture. So we planted a lot more of those than we would have otherwise. So again, The garden's on the flatland, the trees are on the slope. This is at a school garden here. And just some of our plants. Okay, so tree keepers, this is what we call our volunteer stewards. And we're taking this a little bit from the Giving Groves program, where they ask that they have 2 community stewards for each site. We call them tree keepers because our marketing director has a knack for naming things. So it's really cute, fun name. And these are really supposed to be our site directors who are in charge of the pruning, the maintenance people, and the watering. But can also say, well, maybe we want to plant a bunch of bulbs, or we need a bench over here, and they can come to us and say, what about this? And so that our role with Denver Urban Gardens will be increasingly to help facilitate what these folks want to do on the site, rather than them doing what we tell them. Because pretty quickly, it becomes a really big administrative burden if we have 20 sites that we're saying, plant this now, do this, now cut this thing back. We want them to be autonomous. We want them to be unique in their own right. And we want people to be doing their own experiments. So I hadn't heard about all the new things at the Wheat Ridge Garden. Wow, that's so cool that there is stuff that people are going to try. And maybe they want to plant a bunch of medicinal herbs this year, or maybe they, these different community connections, but then they might start kind of looking the same. And then they start to differentiate over time as they deepen into the communities that they're a part of. We say, 30 to 60 minutes per week. We're trying to get people to have a commitment of at least 2 years. It is tough to have people switch off year after year, especially when you're saying, help us out, because in 5 years there will be fruit. Right? We have to kind of bridge some of those gaps. So we're working on doing things like perennial plant propagation swaps and pruning workshops and professional development. Next year, we're probably going to start this Tree Keeper Academy kind of thing, where we have an actual sort of training program about how to care for these spaces. And I would actually love to make some connections over the next couple of days here with some of the folks in the room here, so that we can have people who are interacting with our sites in Denver and are excited about it, and maybe want to make more of a career out of it, who could end up working for a conservation organization before an agroforestry site. And so please let me know if you think you might have a pipeline for folks like that. And also you can let me know, or my colleague, Nikki Baruxis over there. We're the 2 folks who are in charge of this program. So this is our current map. The green are the planted ones. This is the metro area here. The orange are ones that'll be in the fall, and then the blue are potentials. And there's probably double that number of potentials that people have brought up to me. There's all kinds of opportunity for this. I think where we're probably going to go is trying to not do 15 more every year, but helping people to plant theirs and then kind of letting them take care of it. So maybe people come to us and say, could you advise us on planting? Could you come and help do a volunteer workday, get it planted, and then we'll take care of it. So we have kind of a core amount that are actually dug, run, and supported in a centralized way, but trying to maximize our impact beyond that. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of excitement. I know there was mention of the federal funding, and there are, I will also say, maybe this is a good time, there's a lot of federal funding and local funding for trees and tree canopy. One of the things that we kind of run into is that an apple tree does not produce the same amount of shade as an elm tree, or even a hackberry or something like that. And so a lot of the sort of reforestation or afforestation programs are looking at big shade trees. And yeah, I mean, let's plant a bunch of bur oaks. Let's plant some walnuts where we can, and whatever works in our climates for those big trees. But it's not always a good overlap. But I think they can work really well in tandem. So if we're talking about riparian forest buffers, and then right next to that, like a food producing mid-story, because a lot of that's right, like our food producing mid-story is more what we're using here, as opposed to the 40, 50, 60-foot trees. So we're kind of still figuring out how we're going to work with the city of Denver, and those kind of programs, so that we're not competing and we're trying to weave those together. So we source from a few different places. We're trying to nail this down a little bit. Some wholesale and some retail nurseries. We're looking always for disease resistance and drought tolerance, because these aren't getting the same kind of care that they're getting in a backyard or even in a farm situation. So we want them to be gritty and tough. We want all of our apples and pears to be fire blight resistant. And it is so hard to find local nurseries that carry fire blight resistant apples and pears. So I think that's a big area of growth, is like giving people in general access to trees that are going to be successful, not just ones they've heard of. If I see another Red Delicious apple, I can't. So that's, we're planting jujubes, if you're not familiar with that. Amazing pest and drought tolerant tree that comes from sort of Mongolia, northern China. Great climate analog for us, and might be a really good kind of fit in an especially dry area. So we're still kind of figuring out how we flow from bare root trees to potted up trees. We don't have a nursery site ourselves yet. And a lot of times what we're planting, the basic pattern right now is we'll do a fruit or a nut tree, mostly hazelnuts. We're not really doing any other nuts but hazelnuts right now, with a nitrogen fixer, and often like a currant, a gooseberry, golden currants, different types, sometimes honeyberries, and then some of these larger, more semi-native or native plants in between. And you'll also notice that there's like not a lot of other herbaceous plants. I find that because if we're going to plant a lot, we want to make sure we have this idea of legibility. And when I think about a legible landscape, it's you can come in and say like, oh, that's a thing, and that's a thing, and that's a thing. Most of the people in this room could go in and say, oh, I know all these species and I can see how they're interacting. But we want to start with a little bit more of a skeleton, so that people can understand and interact with the landscape in a slightly less complicated way to start. And then hopefully we fill in as we go. This is some of the stuff that we're using. I want to call out. So again, the sourcing, like there's a bunch of really good hybrid hazelnuts, newly bred stuff that is really productive. And it's pretty much one of the only nuts that works in the Front Range. And we're really only using Asian pears and peaches in those extreme north-facing climates. They bloom really early. Still trialing the hybrid persimmon. I also really want to underline bush cherries. If you're not familiar with those, they're sort of the bushing tart cherries, like Romeo and Juliet and Carmine Jewel. These are more agricultural crops, but they're growing really fast. They seem to be really productive early on, and they're kind of an attractor. So that's been really positive. And then working in some of these nitrogen fixers where we can. And yeah, so that's a little bit about that. So our future here is, by the end of this year, we should have interpretive signage at every site. So we're having signs that are going to say, what is this plant? How do you use it? Where does it come from? Maybe a QR code to recipes on our website, that kind of thing. Again, thinking about how can we spark understanding so people use it elsewhere, not just that these sites are independently going to, solve the food crisis in Denver. We're going to slow down to 4 to 6 new sites per year, deepen the activation and interplanting at our existing ones. We would love a greenhouse and nursery propagation site. We're going to look for funding and things around that. And then I think this especially, so it's another thing I'd love to keep talking with folks about is when we are trying to take things like coppicing and interplanting and the disturbance regime stuff that happens in alley cropping or in larger scale situations. I'd love better practices for communicating that in the urban area. So when are we cutting back our nitrogen fixers? How many times a year? What's a good nutrient cycling process so that we can even be teaching that and seeing that and not just having it turn into that overgrown bramble patch. And that's this last thing is just strengthening ties between this so that I'm hoping we can create more and more of this sort of conveyor belt where and interchange where people can come together in urban areas to get inspiration, to exchange ideas, get eyeballs on things where all the people are, and then get them out into the large scale rural areas and things at scale where we can be kind of bringing more people into this this practice, this way of life, this land stewardship, as opposed to thinking about them as sequestered entities, like there's the farm here and the garden over here. So that's sort of my hope, and that's the overall thing. I think we've got a few minutes here. Yeah, we'd love some questions.
I was really curious at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about the volunteer base and activating those volunteers and especially whenever you're like, looking for a two-year commitment. What is that? Do you have to actively seek out those folks, or does the nature and the long history of your organization kind of draw those people to you and then you kind of substitute? What does it look like to activate volunteers and find those people who are going to be in it for long haul?
The question was about what does it look like to activate volunteers? How do we get them, and how do we keep them around for the long haul? I would say that it's definitely a mix of things. Because it's a new program, there's not a lot of understanding about it. We have kind of an open interest form on our website. So if people hear about it, they can come like, oh, maybe I could be a tree keeper. And then we fill out some fields there. The established nature of the organization helps a lot. All of our community gardens are run by volunteer garden leaders, and they're the ones who usually spend 3 to 5 years taking in the plot applications and being the site director for the gardens. And so we have a bit of a model for that within the organization already. It's a little bit different here because there's not necessarily as much people interaction for the food forest as there is for the gardens, because you maybe are just working with the trees, not managing 40 gardeners in a community garden. We do active outreach through social media. We have a separate volunteer coordinator who does the work days and who does all these different things that helps to funnel people. So we kind of always have our antenna out for folks. Definitely the best way it works is if we can find the people who want to get involved first and then get them a site. Like, oh, you're close to this site, let's make it here. And then you're already bought in and you're already excited about it. And I think that long term, we're looking at as an organization towards models where we can pay some of these tree keepers and at least give a stipend. So if we're talking about 30 to 60 minutes a week, you could get, if it's actually that, which it's not really necessarily, but if you're getting $100 a month, that's $20 an hour. And that adds up really quickly. But when we talk about federal and local funding for green jobs and development of green workforce, this is exactly that. And I think we are also looking at trying to make the case for local businesses and cities that if this is a public good, it should be supported by the public. It should be supported by actual funds. You shouldn't just be saying, oh, it's a nice volunteer thing to tinker with. It's like, we are sequestering carbon, we are slowing stormwater runoff, we're providing food. So we should get like just a little bit of this this funding for folks to be able to make that their livelihood. So we're kind of working on both sides of that. That's a really new part of that. But I also would say that the primary driver for most of our volunteers is they want to learn. So if we can give them the yield of, I learned how to take care of a tree, I'm involved with the land, I maybe don't have land of my own to work with, and they want to have something that they feel ownership over. And that's the other, is like, that they can do things autonomously without us telling them. That seems to provide the most buy-in long term. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts about this? Yeah.
Do you see evidence that the kind of work they're doing and also the kind of work Wildlife is doing is stimulating more private land, backyard food forests?
Yeah. The question is, do we see evidence that this work is stimulating more work being done on private land and backyards? It's difficult to say for us because it's pretty early on, but I will say that because we're already ordering a whole bunch of bare root trees, we're started doing a plant sale in the spring where, you know, if I just order 20% more trees, then I say, these are all the trees that we've selected for all these reasons that we're using in our food forest, you can get them here. So that hopefully we have kind of a side-by-side thing. And there's been a lot of response. We had a lot of people buying trees this spring. I think that the next step will really be helping people understand what are we doing with water retention and this land topography, and what are the process steps, developing a little bit of a handbook for that. Because I will say that some of the people who are most involved as stewards and volunteers have already done it in their backyards. So it's sometimes I don't know which direction it's moving. But I do get the sense there's a large appetite for it. And there's a lot of people who are asking like, well, how do I do this? And what's going on? So hopefully we provide more of that. But it'd be great to track it then. Yeah.
I was just curious, a little more information on the hybrid hazelnuts. Are these a cross of the American hazel and European, and are they blight resistant? I'm just curious, where are you getting them from?
Yeah. So the question is about the hybrid hazelnuts. I've gotten them from a couple different places. Most of our hazelnuts this year came from Burnt Ridge Nursery in Washington. They're getting a lot of them from this breeding program at Ohio State. They are, I think that some of them are bred to be more blight resistant, and then some are crosses between the American and the European, and just selecting over time. We got a bunch from Maine, these neo-hybrid hazelnuts they seem to be really vigorous and blight resistant. So at this point, I'm kind of just trying to tap into as many places as I can and send try it out. And oh, this one really grew. And I found that one of the varieties this year probably got killed that we planted last year, probably got killed in that really hard freeze that we had in the Front Range this winter. So we're just going to keep tweaking that. And that is an advantage of having a lot of sites, is we can try it in different ways and then compare and see that, so that hopefully every year we're able to give better and better recommendations for the local practitioner. Yeah. Other questions? Susan, and then
I'm just curious, and you might have mentioned this, I apologize if I missed it, what the land ownership is.
No, thank you.
You're working on.
Yeah, the question was about what the land ownership is. Primarily, we work on ongoing land use agreements. So Denver Urban Gardens owns 7 pieces of land of their gardens, but there's 200 gardens that are not. So we set up a land use agreement, say with Denver Public Schools or with a particular church or somebody who has the land, and saying, this is the area that we're going to use. These are the kind of uses we're going to have in it. And we have them with Denver Parks. We have them with Lakewood Parks and all these different areas. And so those are ongoing a little bit, and they do have the potential to be not renewed. You know, at any point, any of those groups could say, nope, we're out, but that's never really happened. Most of the time, our pitch is, we're going to take care of this for you. And we're going to manage this way, and you don't have to mow it anymore, and you don't have to use the water in this area. And so, so it's, they're not leased, but they are with these kind of cooperative land use agreements. I will also say that the next step, I believe, for urban agriculture in general and urban agroforestry projects like this are land trusts, community land trusts and conservation easement trusts, where you could say, we are going to take all these different parcels of land, which are maybe 2,000 or 3,000 square feet at a time. We're going to put it together, and that's 50 acres. And we're going to actually remove that we're going to put that into its own separate trust. And this is going to be specifically for urban agriculture in perpetuity, and put that into legal frameworks. People are doing that in different parts of the country. I think there's really interesting ways to remove them from either policy or development pressure. Because that's the thing, we also have to make sure that we're going to be able to, you know, if the land gets sold or changed in 5 years, we've wasted a lot of effort. Yeah. Cool. Any last questions? I don't know if I have any more time or if I'm done. Yeah. Donna.
You sort of answered it like a little bit. You talked about cultures with the jujube and the persimmon. And you kind of hinted at it in the thorough something perhaps with the indigenous use of the flower and things. So are you looking into more of the indigenous type of recipes? Like I think you need to stack these roost travel data. Sumac had was a nice lemonade for fruit.
Absolutely. So the question was, are we looking into indigenous species and indigenous uses of native plants in terms of food and medicine? And the answer is yes, for sure. I think so my ideal situation is to establish, I already work in some different contexts with groups like Spirit of the Sun and some of the local indigenous organizations centered around food and growing and food sovereignty. I do want us to use to increase the kinds of plants that we are using. And I think it is really presumptive and problematic for non-native people to try and put that out without indigenous partnership. To say like, oh, this is what this is, and we think this is going to be this recipe, and this is how we can use it. And if that isn't hand in hand with indigenous groups, we're sabotaging, I think, the potential for long-term authentic partnership. So what I really want to do is find one of these sites or multiple of them to actually be something that we can give over these groups and say, we're going to help you plant it, we're going to help source it and put our funding behind it. And then we want to get a different design aesthetic and mindset behind it so that they're actually managing it as opposed to coming from top down, if that makes sense. But yeah, I want us to be like including more yucca. We can like use the flowers and prickly pear cactus and the sumac and choke cherries and all sorts of things. The other thing I will say is that with that in mind, and I'm sure that different folks in agroforestry have dealt with this, you kind of have in a city where you have not a lot of room and you're thinking about trying to address food insecurity and food access. By and large, the domesticated and sort of trialed and sometimes imported food perennials vastly outproduce the native plants. So we're thinking about like pounds of food and amount of food that can get routed different places. That's also a conversation, is like how much, which sites are going to be for more food production, which sites are going to be for more interest in learning and inspiration. And I'm hoping that some of them can be different. They can be articulated in different ways. But yeah, I'm all for continuing to deepen that as we go. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Amazing. And our next presenter is going to be super exciting too. And James, do you want to come up?
Yeah.
With trees, water, and people, and I'll just let you introduce yourself.
Sweet. Thanks, Don.
The clicker, the.
That's forward. That's out.
Perfect.
Thank you for that.
Got it. Thank you.
And I'm gonna try to get those comments.
Yeah, good late morning, everyone. I just realized I'm the guy who has to go right before lunch. So I will try and make it quick. Thanks to Crane, who actually went over a little of our time allotment, because now my presentation can be shorter. But I'm James Calabasa. I come from New Mexico, a little small community called Santa Domingo Pueblo. I've been a transplant here to Colorado now for 13 years. Something about this place just made me stay, live up in Fort Collins. I work for a small little nonprofit called Trees, Water, and People. I'm the Indigenous Lands Program Director for the organization, where we work with multiple communities, indigenous communities across the Americas, here in the United States, as well as Central and Latin America. But yeah, today I'm here to present about the project that our organization has been involved with the local, with other stakeholders and constituents across, the regional footprint of the Southwest. But just for quick context, as well, Trees, Water, and People, pretty sure most of you have never heard of us. We've been in Colorado now for 25 years. We do a lot of post-fire restoration, watershed science, fire ecology, work, predominantly, we're starting to slowly get into the mix of what agroforestry and sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture means to indigenous communities. But before I begin, I first want to open up with the land acknowledgement. Trees, Water, and People respectfully acknowledges that our office in Fort Collins, Colorado sits on the living homelands of the Arapaho, Ute, Cheyenne, and other native groups and peoples who still reside and depend on this land today. Every presentation, if it's formal or informal, our organization makes it a priority to open up with the land acknowledgements because we know that this land here was once stewarded by these groups of people. And, you know, we've come to the opportunity today to be able to continue that stewardship work and continue the informed passage of knowledge and transformation of what can be done moving forward. So a quick background of our project, the Southwest Tribal Agroforestry Project, you know, aims to promote and revitalize traditional agroforestry practices utilized by tribes in the Southwest United States. The project works in conjunction with tribal producers, communities, individuals to really revitalize and reintroduce centuries-old traditional agroforestry practices that may have been lost or that may have been misused over time by highlighting these efforts that uplift cultural relevance of agroforestry practices. So it was really great to hear about all the different projects that are happening in the urban settings, you know, in the rural areas, even, you know, going up to the federal system of funding, like, because I think this all ties, our project ties and connects all of it together because there's a lot of information that we've learned from our team just by being able to participate in this project. So we had 3 key deliverables that are, you know, come forth from this project. The first one was to really produce 3 case study videos and information sheets on tribal-led agroforestry projects through 3 different case study participants. So I'm going to quickly just backtrack and say our project was not really focused on the technical aspects of agroforestry, of like what to plant, you know, where to plant, when to plant. It's more focused on that social community impact of elevating those voices and what they're doing locally or place-based in their communities or in their region. So yeah, the first deliverable was producing 3 case studies, which I will go over the participants here shortly. And, you know, we actually just wrapped up our second case study participant, you know, through a film production, which has been pretty awesome. Our second key deliverable is to produce a synthesis and literature review of what these practices and these methodologies mean to indigenous tribal communities across the Southwest. We know that, you know, the 3 case studies are not representing all the tribes or the communities across the region because one of the biggest myths is that tribes are monolithic and we are not. So each community that we get to work with has a different form of definition of agroforestry, how they connect to the land, what's their origin story, how they use, you know, these food systems or food forests directly into their communities. But what we're trying to do is synthesize the 3 case studies, the information that we get to collect and really produce like some type of a formal report or formal manual that will be accessible to everyone publicly. And then our last key deliverable was to boost webinars and podcasts highlighting tribal agroforestry and civil pasture projects in the Southwest. I know we've been working with SWAAN to, you know, start doing that this summer and hopefully down the road as well. So it's really been great to see all 3 key deliverables starting to mesh and align collectively together on this project. Our primary audience for this project was indigenous communities and groups interested in practicing agroforestry. You know, there's a wide range of communities across just the Southwest footprint who are really looking forward to get back into this practice or looking to, you know, start a nonprofit or that's focused on agroforestry, but just don't know how to get started or don't have the resources. So this project is hoping to really boost, you know, like the experiences and provide information that's coming from our 3 case study participants to be channeled over to these communities and individuals who are looking to start an agroforestry program, project, garden, etc. But we also have a secondary audience, you know, just the general public, you know, individuals, groups like you all who are interested to maybe understand more about the concept of tribal agroforestry, what it means to them, how do they approach it, how do they get their funding, how do they create collaborations, partnerships. So that's where the secondary audience really comes in as well for this project. Yeah, we have a big conglomerate of project partners, working collectively together on this. Quivero Coalition out of New Mexico is the one spearheading this project and effort. They're the ones who received the funding from the USDA National Agroforestry Center, if I believe I'm right. Yep. So they're the ones who gave us a 2-year grant to really focus on like uplifting and elevating indigenous perspectives in agroforestry, because they realized they don't have none of that information on their website or information through resources. So what we're building today is actually going to live on their website once the project wraps up, which is going to be at the end of October of this year. So yeah, it's been great to really work with USDA, been super flexible. There's a lot of calls we had to get on with them regarding, working with tribes, because for the individuals we work with, this is their first time ever doing it. So, every opportunity collaboration is a little different. So it was a learning lesson for all of us. But yeah, SWAAN as well. I see a lot of familiar faces in this room, through Zoom calls. It's great to see you all here, in an organic body and not on a computer. So, but yeah, it was just great to see, how all these different groups, communities have come together to really focus and work with each other on this project. So our first case study that I'll go through and talk about is the Santa Ana Native Plant Nursery. It's located in Santa Ana Pueblo, New Mexico. It's one of the 19 pueblos. They are one of, very few Native American owned operated nurseries in the country. So for them, they are creating a model. They are creating something that, is transformative especially for Native and indigenous communities, because for a long time, Native communities were always thought of like there can be no economic development, no economic growth, no opportunity to, bring and uplift resources for them to start doing these type of operational mechanisms. So for Santa Ana, what we really focused on with their case study and the film was their operation. How did they get funding? How did they start off the nursery? Like, who are their clients? How did they, go into contracts with Forest Service, BLM, Park Service? Because the majority of their clientele are those federal agencies, doing restoration, reclamation projects across the Southwest. But in the nursery specifically, they have 3 main nursery practices or focus areas. One of them is the riparian restoration. So looking at always, bringing back traditional and, native plants back to the bosque of the Rio Grande River, but as well as across the landscape of New Mexico. Forest farming, Crane mentioned a little bit about that term, it's very broad. It can mean many different things. But for the tribal indigenous peoples that we got to talk with, forest farming for them was, really going back into that bosque area, identifying their native plants, and then starting to realize or start to do some inventory of what's left and what can be replanted or regenerated. And then lastly is the traditional plant production. They are a big component of reproducing and planting a lot of traditional melons, chilies, corns, and also starting to look at investing into a seed bank. Collecting and storing seed that has been, in people's houses, just hanging from their roof for, centuries, and actually trying to cool it so that, in 100 years, those seed can be viable again. So it's really great to hear, what this operation, again, being a very one of a kind, tribally owned, managed nursery, to be able to do all this great work. So this is going to be one of the webinars products that will be coming out for SWAAN, hopefully soon. We've been having some issues with the nursery manager scheduling a call with him, but we're hoping that this story will be coming to you all soon through either if it's through the National Agroforestry Center website or through the SWAAN webinars. The second case study was the Santa Clara Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute. This one, they focus and are featuring the traditional agroforestry importance. So really bringing it back to what traditional agroforestry methods and, practices mean to that community specifically. The Santa Clara Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute is a nonprofit. It's very small. It has a educational learning center, but it also has this food forest that we had the opportunity to like walk through with Roxanne Swensel. She, talked about the importance of like how her people in the community have collected, certain berries, fruits, nuts, that were local to that landscape, and how climate change is starting to affect the harvesting routine or pattern of those specific trees.
Where is it located?
It's in Santa Clara, Pueblo, New Mexico, so 45 minutes north of Santa Fe. Yeah. So, and then again, she talked about forest farming, traditional art, agroforestry practices, windbreaks, which was, very surprising to hear how her house is in the middle of this, little food forest. But, for her, she said during the winter, it keeps her house nice and warm. And in the summer, it keeps her house nice and cold. So she was talking about how in the past, her community and other communities in the northern New Mexico area will build their houses around a lush forest area because that's how they were able to survive the harsh winters and stay cool during the summer. So it's really great to hear about how the natural building of adobe intermixing and connecting with the food forest made sense in this landscape. But then lastly, the civil pasture, we went to go explore and visit the learning center that they had there, and they had like a common today's common civil pasture concept of line or row crops of fruit trees with some lush grass. I think it was, I can't remember the grass species, but anyways, it was a place where they were trying to pilot and bring in local ranchers so that their sheep and their goats can graze that area, but still be available to produce a lot of the apples and oranges that were local to that landscape. Our third case study is at Tewa Women United. What we're featuring with them in this project is the women and gender advocacy. They really highlighted how women play an important role in this practice. For the most part, we hear about men taking, the spearheading role or being the ones out there, doing the gardening and, all of this traditionally through, a lot of the tribal and indigenous communities. But for this group, a group of women who now have that nonprofit organization, Tewa Women United, they talked about what they learned from their grandmas, the stories of the maternal role in this practice, which was very beautiful and strong. Me being from that region too, like I never heard about it until I went to go visit this unique place. Some of the practices that they value within their organization is environmental justice. So access back to land, access back to certain areas where they can harvest and collect certain, berries, nuts, medicinal uses. So this group actually has a memorandum of agreement with the city of Espanola, New Mexico, where they have a what they call the healthy food oasis on an uphill slope part of the city, where they use that space to bring the next generation of leaders and the non-tribal folks together to discuss certain and important issues of social equity and impact. That goes along with healing justice. Native American women have one of the highest rates of domestic violence, and so they're using this place of an agroforestry civil pasture concept to bring a healing purpose back to Native women, a place where they can feel safe and their voices can be heard. So it was really strong and powerful to be able to be there with them that day and listen to why their organization exists and how agroforestry plays a much deeper role in just the production cycles through the harvesting, et cetera, et cetera. So this is our third case study that we're highlighting as part of our project. Just quick project highlights and lessons learned, from as we move forward in this project is amplifying and revitalizing tribal agroforestry practices. So it's really reconnecting those past lessons and trying to connect it with the future. Like, how can we move forward by utilizing a lot of those centuries old practices that, at once were sustainable and we're able to live in coexistence and harmony with the land and applying it in today's agroforestry methods. And then one of the lessons that we learned is that, traditional agroforestry knowledge is wider than conventional agroforestry practices. It's, diversity in practices of sustenance, economic production, ceremonial use, self-healing, a place for migratory birds, even animals to come and really reconnect to that community and to that landscape. So it was one of the biggest lessons we learned was we came in very narrow-minded into the project and thinking that we're just going to get a basic definition. We're just going to get like, this is what we're planting, this is what we're doing. But instead, we're walking out of this with so much knowledge and so much information that, again, has a wider net of what traditional agroforestry methods mean to these communities. One of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that I thought would be great to highlight is, why it's important to learn and respect tribal processes, because we were on continuous multiple calls within the National Agroforestry Center regarding how come we haven't got the logo yet? How come, we can't produce the video? It's like the tribes are sovereign nations. There's a protocol, there's a process that you have to follow to be able to work with them. Because once you follow and respect those local tribal ethics and processes, it leads to more honest long-term relationships. And I remember Crane mentioned that earlier in his talk too, the only way you can work with indigenous communities is being transparent and honest and not forcing things. And so this was just a few examples that we learned and picked up from this project specifically, and relaying it back to the National Agroforestry Center is, there's not paperwork, there's just multiple rounds of conversations. There has to be a memorandum of agreement. There has to be, protection of sovereignty of both land and knowledge that takes place before you start filming, or capturing these observations from the communities. So it was really great feedback, for them to learn as they move forward in this area of working with tribal communities. Yeah, this is my final slide, just, for the next steps of what we're doing. We are in the final stages of our case study video editing. So our filmographer is, doing nonstop work of trying to get this all ready to go by the end of August, because the funder, NAC, wants, something solid by then, so they can start putting it on their website by October. We're also finalizing synthesis papers and information sheets. We're thankful to work with a few graduate PhD level students who are doing a lot of the synthesis and the coding of what the information we're collecting from these communities. We're looking forward to collaborate with SWAAN again for future webinars, not just a part of this project, but other projects moving forward. I think there's a lot that we can all learn from tribal communities, indigenous groups, nonprofits who are doing this type of work. And then lastly is just, why stop now? I know our funding is going to exhaust soon, but there's a lot of funding out there that, I think we can really come together and start expanding and replicating these projects with different communities across the Southwest or even across the entire country. But yeah, that's all I have. I just want to make a quick note too. So Leah Potter White, she is the project manager. She works with the Quivira Coalition. Her and I, have been part of this project since day one, but she has more of the administrative information with the relationship with the National Agroforestry Center. But yeah, it's just been a great opportunity to work with her and others on this project as well. Thank you. Yeah, anyone have any questions?
Thank you, James, for a wonderful, deep presentation. Thank you for the nice round to SWAAN.
Mhm.
And your last slide kind of answers my question, but I wondered if you could, because of Quivira leading this project, if you could give a little bit more background in Quivira and what they do.
Yeah.
Besides not simply, but only this particular project.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So from my knowledge, the Quivira Coalition is based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. They're not. Oh, repeat the question. I just saw that. So the question was, Kim, I provide a little bit more context of who the Quivira Coalition is, what they do, and how the collaboration with my organization and them has been, going so far. So the Quivira Coalition they're based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I think they've been around since about the same time as my organization is, so like the late 90s. They really focus a lot on grassland, rangeland, and sustainable agriculture. They work with a lot of private landowners, in the Southwest, but as well recently trying to get into more of the tribal engagement and collaboration form of it as well. This is our third project that we're working on with Quivira, through Trees, Water, and People. Our first two were heavily focused on rangeland conservation and water conservation methods. So this is really was a unique opportunity for us to expand our own lands to, work with Quivira because they have expertise in this, they have the staff, they have, a long track record of doing this type of work in the Southwest. But yeah, Leah is, that's her contact info if you ever want to, reach out to her, but Sarah, can't remember her last name. She's probably, if she sees this, she's gonna be like, James, you should know my last name. She's the executive director of Quivira Coalition, and but all of them are awesome. We have a really great relationship, partnership with that organization.
Hey, I just wanted to put a follow-up plug in with the Quivira Coalition there. A guy I was able to meet through them. I'm born and raised in New Mexico as well, but his name's Gordon Tooley, and he's up in True Trust, New Mexico. And they have a neat operation and focus particularly on growing fruit trees of unique varieties within the native soil there. And we've grown a few of them here at Chatfield Farm, but anyway, there's a lot of great people coming out of there, and that's one I always like to put in people's minds. So look up some of these trees.
Cool, well, definitely do. No, thanks for that.
Would you repeat that for our Zoom friend?
Yes, sorry.
Trees, right?
Truly Street. Yeah, what was her name?
My name's Eric.
Eric. Eric, just mentioned he's from New Mexico as well and has a long, history and, known people in northern New Mexico. So he recommends looking up Truly's Trees. They're based out of True Trust, New Mexico, which, by the way, I highly recommend going down there if you're ever in that part of the state. It's very beautiful. But yeah, check them out.
Yeah, I am Jonas Zamora from the National Institute of Agriculture, USDA. You mentioned in your slides about environmental justice. Can you elaborate a little bit more of that in the context of the tribal needs?
Yeah, so the good question. So the question was, if I can elaborate a little bit more on the concept of environmental justice and what it means or plays in our project. So, working with the 3 case study participants, their idea of environmental justice was not just the concept of like access back to the landscape, but, looking at how tribes can, really have a strong input and perspective towards the restoration and regeneration or even sustainability of these critical landscapes and ecosystems. But it also that, to extend more on that, that means, maybe going into certain types of MOAs of like co-stewardship, co-land management. And that's really common on the Forest Service side and the tribes, because one of the organizations or the case study participants, the Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute, is about to go into that type of agreement where that institution can provide certain expertise and certain knowledge that the Forest Service may find or may be able to incorporate into land management practices. So that's really where it is, but it also includes water justice. Like how tribes are senior water right holders. That's a big quotation. Senior water right holders. So like allowing them to start exercising that power more thoroughly, especially in the years of drought and in the arid Southwest. So that was another concept, that we learned from the Santa Ana Native Plant Nursery, is that like the water district that oversees or manages that section where the reservation is located is constantly like your overuse of your water. You got to start, cutting back so other farmers and other users downstream will have access to it. But for these tribes, they've been in this landscape or these communities since time immemorial, that they need to start exercising that water rights more thoroughly and using their power of sovereignty in that system.
Is it the same thing for food allocation food security?
For food security, a little bit, I think that kind of goes to where the idea of having access to harvest, having access to collect, because a lot of these, and it's not just for food, it's again for ceremonial use, like for the Pueblos, their livelihoods depend on the Douglas fir. So annually, each tribe will go and harvest that tree, for ceremony, for dances, etc. So that kind of plays into that role of why tribes need to start having access back to ancestral lands or be able to have co-management opportunities within that certain landscape, even if it's, managed by Forest Service, BLM, Park Service, whoever, that's part of that environmental justice, is that tribes should, first of all, they should get the land back, but they should have access to those certain areas for harvesting.
Awesome.
James,
Yeah,
this is Beverly on Zoom. I just want to make sure we don't forget that we've got people here that have questions as well. So can I just jump in and have Sarah ask a question?
yeah, totally.
All right, Sarah, go ahead.
Hello, James. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I had the privilege a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, to visit Flowering Tree and to get to meet Roxanne Swenzel and be on a workshop on the property and on the farm. And what I think was amazing about it is this, beyond the urban, beyond the forestry part and the seed saving, it really feels like it's a complete holistic approach to life, right? Like the infrastructure, I think one of the greatest things they did was this Pueblo food experience, which they basically had a community of people of all ages really try to go back to a pre-contact diet and what that looks like on their health. And I thought that was fantastic. So my question to you is, are you finding that a lot of the indigenous communities that you're working with are not just thinking about like a small segment, but are really thinking about a lifestyle, a different way of just becoming closer to nature, closer to, what they traditionally would have done in a modern kind of way? I'm wondering if that's the case with other projects. But again, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Yeah, no, thanks for that great question, Sarah. Yes, we are finding, with like the communities that I work with through my organization specifically, who did not participate in this project, are looking to really take that path of a holistic kind of regeneration or restoration of their cultural and community livelihoods. So that means, establishing more gardens or establishing more programs specifically for youth, because for a lot of these communities, language is like the center of their culture. And with the loss of language, you can't really be able to connect with the land, with, the natural elements of earth. So for a lot of these communities, language is a big component towards youth engagement, community outreach, but as well as, trying to remove kind of like what they call the colonized diet of introduction of, unhealthy fats, foods, etc., by starting to re-engage and revitalize their connection to the land. So like for example, my community of Santo Domingo Pueblo, it's happening right now. We're seeing a lot of funding and resources coming in to establish these food forests, greenhouses, but also teaching young native youth to understand the importance of farming, agroforestry techniques, because for the longest period of time, that was our livelihood as well. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Sarah, but no, I think that was a great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm wondering, and knowing that practitioners and tribes are not monolith by any means, what kinds of things have you heard from folks about what they need and want to thrive? Like I'm thinking about like all the people in this room, and like, is it more eyeballs and awareness? Is it money? Is it land? Is it things that like to push this forward? What have you heard from people on the ground?
Yeah, a lot of it is really, so the question is what tribes and indigenous like nonprofits groups need in terms of support from like the non-tribal groups. So the big one is always the capacity. I think even for maybe some of us in this room, capacity is a big burden and big issue as well. But for them, it's, they have like maybe one person wearing 3 or 4 or even more hats. hats, no, like they're the field technician, they're the volunteer coordinator, but it's always that idea of like getting more and more people from that community specifically to engage in that type of work. Because not only does it, help promote like and transfer that knowledge of traditional agroforestry knowledge, but it creates economic development. It keeps that money within that community versus bringing someone outside to do contract work or hiring labor from the outside. So that's always the biggest component. But then the second thing is unrestricted funding. Because the timelines between tribes and how the government system, if it's federal, state, local, they don't always match up. There's always shifts in priorities for tribes. Like we just had a drought, we just had a fire. Like last year, New Mexico was ablaze, from the state's biggest fire. So like communities had to shift, but that grant period was still on the same clock. So that was another big thing, is like, how can we start rewriting the narrative of, how funding to tribes can be more flexible and unrestricted, so that gives more autonomy to that organization or that community to be like, we really need to hire someone else, but this grant money won't allow personnel hiring, et cetera. But then the third thing we always listened to was infrastructure. A lot of the funding that these organizations do get is very limited in infrastructure and expansion. So for case point in the Flowering Tree Hill Permaculture Institute, they want to build a seed bank, a nice, up to date, or what they call state of the art cooling system. So seed can be stored, their native seed, but they don't have the funding to really build that bank within their property just yet. Right now, they're working with Santa Ana, but Santa Ana is also starting to get to capacity on the cooling bank. So those are just the three common ones that we hear from at least these case study participants. Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, if any questions, feel free to grab me or send me an email.
We just shared one program that I happened to notice we have a bunch of seedlings ready to go up to 9 weeks.
Yeah.
So another whole project and some community food, sourcing and reforesting going on up there. And then you mentioned for Vera, for you want to get on the website and volunteer for some of the things. Because I also got to meet Roxanne. Yep, and my husband, what was the name of that community that we kept pronouncing incorrectly with Abiquiu with But there's so much you can learn just volunteering and being a participant. We did some riparian restoration on the flowering tree. So, and with that in mind, though, we'll turn you over to James to sort of summarize the morning and introduce Anna, if you would, and I'll bring her slides. All right.
Hey, so I'm Jim Allen, and my charge was to kind of summarize some of the highlights and themes of the morning. So I've been jotting down notes as we went, and I'll just kind of summarize that, take maybe up to 5 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to Ann Marsh. Wanted to start with around the thank yous. We've already heard some thank yous for Ghana, and she did an amazing amount of work to pull this together, and it's a really good program that she pulled together. But she had some really good help, including some here today, like Amy, and still back in Phoenix, Beverly Babb, who's very involved with the logistics of delivering our programming. Those two are from the Arizona Community Tree Council, which has been a really big sort of supporter of SWAAN, really. So thank you, Amy. Thank you, Bev. Really appreciate that logistical support that makes a meeting like this run smoothly. I also want to thank the USDA National Agroforestry Center, which has been a great supporter of SWAAN. And, we just heard of another project they supported that James described. We're really fortunate to have not only the current director, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, but also the immediate past director, who you've already heard from, Susan Stein, and the director before that, Andy Mason. So we have three of the current or former directors. They have provided really important leadership in agroforestry nationally, but have been really, really supportive of our southwestern efforts and getting SWAAN up and running, continuing to support us. The final thank you is to the speakers this morning. Really good quality talks this morning. For me, the morning just flew by. It was really, really an interesting mix of talks. So thank you all who spoke this morning. So as I was jotting notes down, trying to synthesize it as we went, I identified what I think are four main sort of themes that I heard. The first one being that this is a great time of opportunity for agroforestry, possibly an unprecedented time in terms of the support that's available, the career tracks that are available for young people. We heard about some of the funding that has increased recently. We also heard about ongoing programs like EQIP that maybe we need to take better advantage of to learn how to take better advantage of. Hearing about all the hiring is exciting for me as an educator, telling people about agroforestry, and they ask me, well, what are the career paths for agroforestry? And, you know, increasingly there really does seem to be career options related to agroforestry. So to me, it's really exciting. We need to learn how to work the system a little better, to be aware of what are the opportunities, but they're out there, and they're out there in greater amounts than I think they've been really in years. Certainly in my career, I think it's really somewhat unprecedented. At the same time, there are definitely barriers and challenges, and we heard about some of those today. Some of them are just awareness or understanding of how to work through the grant system. In some cases, we really need to think about how those things work, like you mentioned, James, about how some of that grant cycles and all of them necessarily work well for tribes. So there's definitely barriers that we need to think about. Susan, in your report, you talked about you know, having to do farm plans or forest plans, and in some cases that may not be the greatest fit in urban areas. I also heard about the hiring bottlenecks. Even though there's this great effort to hire a lot of new people, it's going slowly. There are definitely bottlenecks, especially in the government agencies, to getting these people on board. But we also heard a lot about other kinds of challenges or barriers. They could be zoning, ordinance barriers. They could be neighbor issues, acceptance. There could be just interactions between the people operating a community type project. And so I heard about people learning to overcome those barriers, but those barriers are real and they're out there, and we need to learn how to work better through some of those barriers, be they fire blight or grant bureaucracies, you name it. There's a big range of barriers that we're gradually overcoming better and better, I think. One thing that I found really encouraging was just the range of really good examples of work that's being done on the ground. We heard a lot from some of the speakers today, either about their own projects or projects that they profiled, for example. You know, I did with Andy a paper on urban food forests. And at the time, we tried to learn about as many as we could. But there are so many more than we were aware of at the time we put that paper out. I learned of more today. It's really quite exciting to learn about how many projects are out there already that we can learn from, and that ideally could serve as good demonstration sites. And then the final theme is that partnerships and networking is really, really critical. We need formal interagency partnerships, and I'm seeing some of those. Some of those go beyond the government agencies to the nonprofit organizations. We need informal networks, and those also seem to be out there as well, but we could use more of those. To make those kind of things work, we need the people like you that are in this room. And one thing that I find really exciting is the range of people that are in this room. We have NRCS represented, we have NEFA represented, we have Forest Service represented. So we have a number of government agencies, both state and federal, and I think even local. We need this sort of interaction and engagement. One thing I heard about Today, just briefly, I need to learn more about it, is that there is a policy level group that's pushing agroforestry to the forefront, or more to the forefront at least, in agricultural policy. And we absolutely need operators at the national level doing that, bringing more resources for research as well as for on the ground programming. But to me, it's just incredibly exciting that people are coming together from a range of different backgrounds all around agroforestry. Things are really starting to happen. I see momentum building that is evidenced by the folks in this room. And to me, it's just really exciting to be here, to be part of this group SWAAN and partners with you. I really hope while you're here, you'll interact and network as much as you can with each other, and maybe come out of here with some new partnership ideas, some new grant proposal ideas, things of that sort. So thank you all so much for being here. To me, there are so many benefits, and we heard a few of them. Anything from just basic food production to biodiversity, climate change, urban heat island effects. There's so many benefits that we can realize if we work together to promote agroforestry. And certainly one group that is leading the effort is the National Agroforestry Center. And at this point, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Ian Marsh to talk about the center and what they're doing.
Hey. That was an absolutely fantastic overview. So I am just thrilled to be here today with many of the folks who've gone before me. So let me figure out how to work this. So I am the new director of the National Agroforestry Center. I started at the end of last year, and I know did we turn the battery up?
Sorry, I was looking for our lunch delivery.
So is it on? It is not. Let's see. Batteries just run out.
No, I can fix it.
Up. Yeah,
That's forward,
Yep,
that's
yeah.
backwards.
great. So I know many of you are familiar with this center, but for those of you who aren't, we were authorized under the 1990 Farm Bill. We are a joint initiative between Forest Service Research and Development, where I'm stationed, Forest Service State, Private and Tribal Forestry, and NRCS. So we are the only unit in USDA that's explicitly dedicated to agroforestry. So as a result, we work across all different agencies in USDA and of course with partners. And we do this, we really work to accelerate the adoption of agroforestry. And we do this by leading, catalyzing, coordinating, and conducting both research and science-based outreach. So we have really three main focus areas. The first is really understanding the ecosystem services provided by agroforestry, and increasingly trying to quantify those services so that they better align with programs and those benefits can be realized. Second, understanding the human dimensions of agroforestry. Where is it being practiced? What motivates producers to implement agroforestry or maintain agroforestry practices? And third, promoting agroforestry educations, networks, and support, to support our partners in the field. So we are just, as Jim said, we're just seeing an explosion of interest in agroforestry. And I think this is partially due to the Inflation Reduction Act and the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities, and the fact that agroforestry is classified, or several of the practices are classified as climate smart practices. But I also think it's a testament to all of the past work that Mac's done, Susan and Andy has done, and networks like SWAAN have done to really get the work out on agroforestry. So we are definitely in program building mode. We have a new agroforestry climate scientist, Mark Batchelor, who's stationed in Corvallis, Oregon. NRCS has a new technical assistant to agroforester, Pam Bergstrom in Lincoln. We have 3 different new ORISE fellows. That's sort of a mechanism we can use to get people on pretty quickly in this backlog and government hiring. And we are really pleased that NRCS is going to be bringing on a national agroforester. They haven't had one in years, so they've committed to doing that, and hopefully that person will be on in the not too distant future. We sadly lost the Forest Service lead agroforester, Rich Straight. I'm sure many of you know him, retirement in May, but we are backfilling in that position. Pete McFarland is currently acting in that position. The good news for the Southwest is Rich's daughter has bought property in Arizona, so he's going to be spending more time in the Southwest. So with this new demand, we're really trying to ramp up technical support for technical assistance and training in the next 2 years. We're doing this with both virtual and field-based trainings that are being led by the NRCS lead a technical assistance agroforester, as well as NACD with support from NAC. So these trainings are going to be regional to state based, and really provide enough information to, detailed enough information to support planning and implementation. So as these are built out, we'd certainly be interested into tapping into all of your expertise and networks, and there may be opportunities for some subcontracts. We're also working to better leverage the USDA Climate Hub network. We're bringing on a new fellow to help, get the information that NAC and others have developed on agroforestry better integrated into that network. The Southwest network, Hub network, is led by Emily Elias from ARS. If you don't know her, I'm happy to make that introduction. She's absolutely fantastic. And we're really, we recognize that peer-to-peer learning and case studies like the ones James just mentioned are just critically important. So we are in the final stages of pulling together sort of a compendium that's going to include about 300 place-based videos, demonstrations, case studies, enterprise budgets. These are all going to eventually go up on the NAC website, hopefully by the end of this calendar year. So it will include, the wonderful products James is helping develop, as well as have a number of other urban case studies as well from Austin and Washington DC, and a lot of wonderful stories, including some dryland silvopasture case studies, which may be of interest. And we are just always trying to get the word out on USDA programs that can support agroforestry through publications, through webinars, through notices of funding opportunities from different agencies. It's a challenge when a program isn't, an agroforestry, funding opportunity. It does make it more difficult for people to find it in their program. So we're there to help support that as well. We're making really good progress on the National Agroforestry Producer Survey. I know from the 2017 census that agroforestry is practiced on about 1.5% of farms. This survey is just going to give us that critical, much more detailed, practice-specific information. How how it's being used, where it's being used, how many operations are practicing, individual agroforestry practices. And then we're going to take this information from the survey and use it plus other data from NRCS and obviously literature and some modeling, but to get some better estimates on carbon stocks in agroforestry. At the same time, we are working with NRCS and ARS as part of the Inflation Reduction Act to get better carbon methodologies for monitoring agroforestry. We're also working to finish up a guidebook for selecting tree and shrub species for agroforestry. This guidebook is going to have over 90 species profiles and allow producers to really identify or technical service providers identify species based on attributes that are desired by producers, as well as general biogeochemical information, that type of thing. Really appreciate those in this group who may have supported that project. It's also going to include some practice specific chapters that will provide more general information about attributes of species and desired in particular practices, as well as urban and indigenous uses. We continue to develop budget tools. We're about to roll out a forest farming calculator that will allow producers to calculate income from woody understory plants for the botanicals market. Nurseries are just a key concern for USDA with the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as IRA. And as part of that, NAC is working with the University of Maine to better identify supply and demand issues for agroforestry species in nurseries. We're really focusing right now, at least on federal nurseries and private nurseries. And so hopefully this will give us some better idea of any challenges with the supply chain. We continue to produce tech transfer pubs. These are available in paper that you can order from us. So if you just want something for an event, and they're also available on our website. We'll have new ones coming out on some windbreak features. We're going to try and do some more urban specific agroforestry technical notes, as well as some looking at silvopasture and fuels and wildfire. So silvopasture, especially with given its climate adaptation and mitigation potential, especially when you convert it from pasture, is certainly getting a lot more interest. Interestingly, even the National Forest System is also showing slight interest in silvopasture from a wildfire fuels perspective. We have conducted a pilot research study looking at silvopasture and fuels and carbon in the Pacific Northwest. We'd really be interested in expanding that study to other parts of the country, in Southwest, Southeast. If there are sites, if this is something that you'd be interested in participating in, certainly reach out to me. Also, if you have ideas of cross-border demonstration sites for silvopasture is another thing which would be pretty interesting. So in closing, I just want to say, we value the partnership with SWAAN and the work that SWAAN does, just so important. I mean, partnerships make NAC more effective. They just do. Agroforestry needs expertise from many different disciplines, and it also benefits from many different experiences. So you really help us get the word out, you connect us to the work on the ground, and you provide us with valuable information as well. So thank you for that. And, look forward to having conversations with everyone over the next few days. So thanks a lot. Getting to be lunch.
Yeah,
We can move to
thank you.
lunch. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it is lunchtime, networking time again, so just another round of applause and thanks to our speakers from this morning. It's just been a really fascinating day and having conversations again with our forestry CEU. At the end of the day today, if anyone meeting those, they're on really great to say CEUs. See that gentleman over there. Enjoy lunch and thank you, Amy.